Hello, freedom loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. You've got Glenn and myself today, and we are joined by Ambassador Anthony Godfrey, who was the U.S. ambassador to Serbia. And I'm going to ask you to make sure I get this right, Ambassador. You can't believe everything you read online. 30 years in the State Department, 12 years in the Navy before that. Lots of service to this country. Thank you so much for what you've done. I can't wait to dig into where you've served. We're going to talk Serbia. We're going to talk the Balkans. And Glenn, you two know each other well. So I'll pass it to you to share a little bit of your background.
Ryan, and hello to all our viewers or listeners. And it is great to have Anthony Godfrey, Ambassador Godfrey, on the podcast. Yes, I serve with Anthony. I can't say where. I could say it was very cold there a lot of the year. Anthony, as you said, just if we focus on the State Department side, served him some really tough and amazing assignments. And I'll let him get into that. And maybe we should have him just go over that so the viewers know we're talking to a heavy hitter here. And then just a quick note, we decided to do Serbia and the Balkans today because it's an issue that doesn't tend to get a lot of attention with everything else going on right now. But we always, with the podcast, we want to do topics that are probably important for U.S. national security, the geopolitics, and things that may spring up and become problematic for our listeners. And we want them to get a little advanced knowledge of those issues. And I think the Balkans is one of them. So
thanks very much, Glenn, for having me on. It's really a pleasure. And I'm sorry that we can't talk about where Glenn and I served together, but I can agree that it was pretty cold there. Yes, I did just a little less than 30 years with State, but 12 years with the Navy. It was the Navy that taught me my Russian, by the way, and I really enjoyed studying Russian in Monterey. I actually got pretty good at it. But with State, as soon as they found out that I spoke Russian, they're gonna pigeonhole me in the former Soviet Union. I started out in Belarus, and after 2 years, I was declared persona non grata because I was the human rights officer. And if I hadn't been declared persona non grata, I probably wasn't doing my job. And then after I left there for a short while, and then I ended up being sent to Chechnya. And I served in Chechnya for a while as the deputy head of the OSCE assistance group. And I know you folks talked about my friend Ramzan Kadyrov, not my friend Ramzan Kadyrov, in your last podcast a little bit. So I served in the Russian desk. I served in Croatia not long after the wars. It wasn't the lovely place that it is now, and the tourist destination. It was a little bit different, but it was still beautiful, and the folks there are really interesting. Served in Armenia, served in Turkey, did a tour at the White House, served in Iraq, and then I was the director for Iraq affairs. And then I served in Moscow for 4 years, from 15 to 19. And that was a pretty dramatic time for our relationship. But then every time is dramatic in Moscow. And then after the assignment in Moscow, I was nominated by President Trump during the first administration to be the U.S. ambassador in Serbia. And after a pretty brief but still torturous period through the confirmation process, I got out to Serbia in 2019, and I served until 2022. A lot of challenges at the time. The Kosovo and Serbia are always a challenge, and we can talk about that. Kosovo and its relations with other states in the Balkans are really interesting. Its path towards the EU, its balancing of the West and Russia, all these things are really interesting, and they're really dramatic. How Serbia is influencing the chaos that is Bosnia and Herzegovina. These are all really interesting things that we can talk about. But it's a wonderful place. I was glad to see that Glenn enjoyed his visit there. Must have been a lot of fun. I think, in the almost 3 years now since I've retired, I've almost lost all the weight that I gained when I was in Serbia. The food is great. It's great. But I'm almost there. I'm going to get there, I promise. But since I retired, I decided to live in that wonderful place called Not Washington. And as punishment for my many sins, I'm now teaching undergrads here in Richmond. So that's fun.
So Anthony, let me start out with this question, because you are teaching, you're molding young minds. I'm sure a lot of your students are interested in the foreign service and serving the government, going into national security. And you are, I know, we talked about this before the podcast. I know from our time together, you're someone who's invested in studying the foreign languages, the languages of the countries where you serve. What do you tell your students in terms of the importance of studying, whether it's Russian, Turkish, Serbian, Arabic? What's your message to our listeners, and to the young people out there that are interested in careers in government.
It's absolutely essential. And it's not just the language, though, Glenn. It's the whole context. You have to understand the context. You have to understand the literature, the history, the geography, the economy. You cannot understand the United States without understanding what the Civil War was. You can't understand the United States without understanding what our relationships are like with our neighbors to the north and south. You have to have the whole picture. Otherwise, you don't understand it. So I really enjoy pushing this out there to my students. The thing that I think we've corrected, so when I joined the Foreign Service, your ability to speak a foreign language wasn't one of the criteria that they judged, which is wacky. And now we allow people to serve in countries where they've got maybe 2 generations ago, provided there aren't any security issues, some ancestry, and they've got the actual understanding of the places where they're serving. Lots of fun.
I'm going to take a quick detour before we jump into the Balkans. Ambassador, you mentioned you were PNG'd out of Belarus. Just for people who have never been PNG'd, or you've heard this term, or you've seen it in movies, what was it like? You get reprimanded?
So I thought it was like that. I thought it was like that. And it's an interesting story, and it's not as direct as it normally is. When you're declared persona non grata, then the host government, the receiving government, according to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, sorry, I'm a teacher now, you're in that country at the invitation of and with the permission of the host government. And if they withdraw that permission, then not only are they asking you to leave, but they are withdrawing your diplomatic status, your immunity. So that's gone. You have to leave. And I was a pretty junior diplomat. I'd already served in the Navy a good bunch of times, but this diplomat stuff was all new to me. And that is Alexander Lukashenko, who's still the president, decided that if there were protests against the great Alexander Lukashenko, then somebody else must have been organizing it. And it must be that guy who we see observing all of the protests. So that's why they decided to declare me persona non grata. But our ambassador at the time, who was Ken Yalowitz, an extraordinary American who served as ambassador a couple of places, but also served in Moscow, may look like a mild-mannered older Jewish guy, but he is tough as nails. And he told the Belarusians, if you want him to leave, you're going to have to declare him PNG, and there's going to be consequences. How ready are you to bear those consequences? And, if you're the American ambassador, you get to act like the American ambassador, which is kind of fun from time to time because, we are the biggest and the baddest. But then after I finished my assignment, which was almost over, then they declared me persona non grata anyways. So they did it kind of cheapy, so they didn't have to pay for it. But it was an interesting time.
Love it.
So let's not compare that to what happened when the Russians declared 60 of my colleagues persona non grata and gave them a very short time to get out of Russia with their families, pull their kids from school, destroy their lives, left us with empty desks. And they focused on the people who were doing the most good for the relationship. These weren't spies. These were the people who spoke the best Russian. They got us there, the biggest investment. And it was really hard for those folks. They knew that they hadn't done anything wrong, but it was really tough. It was really tough. So,
Highly disruptive.
Highly disruptive to our work, highly disruptive to the relationship, and really disproportionate. So if we kick out a bunch of Russian diplomats from the United States and their intel folks, I don't want to say they're a dime a dozen to the Russians, but the relationship that they're trying to create isn't one that is people to people. And the United States is trying to build that kind of relationship. So it's a huge investment in talent and time, having people study Russia and Russian for years before they take an assignment. And then once you're PNG from Russia, you're never going back. So that is a wasted investment. And the Russians were trying to hurt us, let's face it. And they did.
There was a great cartoon on the wall of the British embassy in Moscow, and it was a guy being called in by his boss, a British diplomat, and it says, "Oh, Smidley, we're sending you to Moscow because you're the best guy to get PNG'd." And it kind of comes to the territory in a place like Russia, unfortunately. But
Right.
it is very, very, like for families, it can be very, very traumatic.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. But we did our best by the folks when they got PNG'd. And I think we did pretty well. We had the advantage of having a terrific political appointee ambassador who is willing to bring his own personal weight to help address the problem. And
Amen.
one challenge that was in particular I mean, they didn't want to send a plane to take our people back. And they said, well, you could just buy tickets and stuff like that. And it's like, wait a minute, the Russians sent a plane to take the intel people that we kicked out of Washington and New York. The Brits sent a plane. How come you guys can't? Anyway, we got it done. It was really difficult though. Anyway, so I saw your last episode. It was terrific. I really enjoyed it. You guys had a more optimistic view of what the president is trying to do on Greenland than I did.
Can we hear it, Ambassador? We'd love to get your take.
Yeah, I don't agree. I mean, what you didn't talk about was, okay, if security in Greenland or in the high north is the driving force behind this, where is the threat coming from? What's the threat coming from? What is it? It's Russia, right? And what's the best defense against Russian aggression in the high north? It's not a sovereign base in Greenland. It's a strong NATO. So anything that we do that undermines the alliance, in my view, or the confidence of our allies and partners, it helps the Russians and helps the Russians in the high north. And then another thing, you guys didn't talk about this, but the idea of a sovereign base outside of the United States, think of how our European allies and partners might worry about how we'd use that. The one sovereign base that we've got outside of the United States is Guantanamo Bay. And what do we use that for? And would a European ally be interested in ceding territory to us, which we could potentially use as an extrajudicial place? So I don't know. I think that the best that we can hope for is what Glenn was suggesting, that maybe it'll get the Europeans to pony up some more defense forces and recognize that this is a serious threat. But I hope that we can do it going forward in a way that doesn't undermine our allies and partners on whom we would rely if there was an actual threat in the high north.
6 months from now, what do you think the status of Greenland will be? What's your best prediction?
Well, I think it is going to be part of Denmark, and I think that there will be a significantly greater military presence there, because I think at some point there has to be a conversation about what the real threat is. I hope, and again, as an old boss of mine used to say, hope is not a policy. I hope that there is something that the president wants to achieve other than making the territory of the United States bigger, and that we'll be able to achieve that in a way that sustains our interests, especially our security interests in the high north. But as the world warms, that whole area is going to be much more important. And the conversation about who gets to decide what the rules are is a diplomatic and international law discussion that's going on right now behind closed doors. And who gets to sit at the table, or more importantly, who doesn't get to sit at the table, is perhaps one of the things that we can agree on with the Russian Federation right now. China, you don't get a seat. You don't have any territory up there. So they desperately want one, though. That's a fact.
Three points on Greenland. One, I'm glad that it's the way that it's gotten attention is not great, but it's gotten attention because it was pretty much being ignored, right? Or the people who were paying attention to it didn't have much of a voice in the national security structure. That's one. Now people have paid attention, and we are seeing the Europeans now commit to sending more troops there, more forces.
Yeah, what are they sending troops there for? To prevent us from being there?
Well, listen, I'm just saying we're seeing it. So it's gotten some attention.
Good.
And the last thing I'll say is I'm glad that the president in Davos said he was not going to use military force to try and take territory. They walked that back because, my retirement fund was being pounded when he originally said it, and they walked back the tariffs. And the last thing I'll say is I absolutely don't agree with the president when he says that NATO has done nothing for the United States. That is, I think, incorrect.
Yeah.
And to say, it's a shame to say that when we do have, we serve side by side with people in the war zones from NATO countries who were great partners, and many of them lost their lives. And we talk about Greenland and Denmark, the Danes proportionally had a large number. So
there was a Dane serving with me in Chechnya.
Yeah. So they, as an American, they've done quite a bit for the United States. There's been value in the relationship. I don't always agree. And I do agree with many Americans who are frustrated that the Europeans haven't been doing enough, or certain European countries. I'll say that certain members of NATO, but to say that that NATO has not been a value to the United States, I can't agree with that. Right. So let's move on from Greenland. We'll go a little south to the east to the Balkans. Right.
So it's an interesting place, and I'm glad you got a chance to visit there, Glenn. But there's a challenge that you've got when you're talking about the Balkans is you have to try and contain your conversation. You can't talk about all of the Balkans. You can't go all the way from the European part of Turkey straight all the way through. You have to figure out some time frame to talk about too. Winston Churchill is reported to have said the problem with the Balkans is that there's too much history per capita. So there's just too much to talk about. So what I would suggest that we do is we talk about the part of the Balkans that used to be Yugoslavia, and then not even all of that, because there are a couple of countries that we could just kind of cross off the list. You don't have to talk about Slovenia. That's now a fat little EU country doing very well, thank you.
And beautiful country.
Yeah.
Absolutely spectacularly beautiful, and it benefited greatly from having an almost non-existent Serb population during the war. So that was a great asset that Slovenia had. So good for them. We don't have to talk so much about Croatia, except insofar as it is, I think, malign influence in Bosnia, stoking the fires of ethno-nationalism, which is a real problem, and that is one of the most effective populist tools that political leaders, especially demagogues, use in that part of the world. So those two countries aside, that leaves Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and a couple of other friends down in the south, including Kosovo. But one challenge or one caution I'd like to put out there as people are trying to understand this subject is when somebody says the Balkans, they assume that the countries that we're talking about are all pretty much the same. They're all pretty much the same. Well, they're not.
Yeah, can you
Serbia is a
walk
lot.
us, Anthony? For a lot of listeners, I think they probably don't know that, or they make
Right.
that assumption. Can you walk us through that? Like that's a really
Sure,
good
I'd be happy to. And the challenge that exists there is Serbia is bigger. It's not just bigger in population and landmass, it's much bigger in economy. So it has an economy that is growing. It is pretty large, and it does okay by itself. It can self-sustain. Its economy can. There are some of the countries there that are so small that they can only exist in an economy that is integrated in with others. North Macedonia is just a couple of, the population is about a quarter of Serbia's. Montenegro, if you look at GDP growth, it looks really good, but it's a country of 400,000 people. So come on, that's not a GDP that is going to have any weight. Serbia also had the benefit of inheriting a lot of the infrastructure of Yugoslavia. So that was an advantage that it had. And it's a slightly larger country than Croatia, certainly in terms of population. Croatia has the coastline and will always be able to benefit from that wonderful tourist industry. But Serbia's got a lot going for it. The Dayton Agreement in 1995 stopped a horrible war because there was strong consensus among the Europeans that we just can't have this anymore. And we sat the leaders of Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina down at a table at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Didn't let them out of the room until we went full Luca Brasi on them. Either your signature or your brains is going to be on this contract. And we created the Dayton Agreement, which, I swear to God, is the Constitution of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it was the Dayton Agreement. It's actually one of the annexes too, but it's part of the agreement. And it created this office of the High Representative, which is a foreigner, and it is a European now. And it created this body that has authority over the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So let's just jump in there. So Bosnia was created recreated as a country, which consists of three people. That is Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the Bosniaks and the Croats, and Republika Srpska. And the reason I'm laying this out is because this is all part of one state. So three people, two entities, one state. Now, what happens when one of the entities says, done, we're leaving? That's what we're facing right now with Republika Srpska, which is part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it is the ethnic Serb part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, led by, although he's not a president at the moment because he got bounced out by the IRAP, led by an ethno-nationalist, corrupt autocrat by the name of Milorad Dodik. So he's a pro-Serb nationalist. Nobody should be able to tell the Serbs what we should do. Everything should be up to us. Why is this person from the European Union authorized to make laws and to declare that my election was illegal? Those are all really good talking points for him. So it's an important challenge that we're continuing to face. But as Bosnia and Herzegovina has argued amongst themselves for decades now, they haven't been able to advance their economy and invest in their infrastructure to the point where things can really get going. The example that we used to love to show to the Bosnians is for the Good Friday Accords in between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and point to them now and say, well, everybody's doing so well that they're not really interested in restarting any wars. So once you get the economy going well enough, maybe people will stop fighting. Well, they haven't gotten to that point, unfortunately. And right now, whoever controls the seat of the entity decides how resources will be distributed. So it's very important to be in charge politically. So this is what benefits Milorad Dodik, who is, again, no nationalist, Serb nationalist, who has been able to distribute the benefits of government in a way that is extraordinarily corrupt. He had been on sanctions for a long time until those sanctions were lifted very recently by the Trump administration, which it was really hard to understand. A very difficult political decision to understand, unless you look at the fact that, well, he'd been under sanction for a long time and it didn't seem to be having any effect. How about we try something else? There's a little bit of that. Why not look at it that way? I try and look at things in the best light possible, or at least try and find a positive light. But what he did was found effective lobbyists, including Rod Blagojevich, to lobby the administration on his behalf, and the sanctions were lifted. So I'm not entirely sure I understand the motivation there.
Bring up a good point that the economy just hasn't been able to develop, right? Why? What's your assessment?
So there are a bunch of reasons why. Economies love predictability and stability, right? Would you want to invest in a place that you don't know what the laws are going to be, whether there's going to be a transparent and equitable justice system, whether if you have a dispute with the government or with a partner, the more important thing is who you know and who you're related to, rather than whether you're right or wrong, or whether the contract is being abided by. So who's going to invest in a place where there's no real certainty? And if you are going to invest, what you want to do is get your return out as quickly as possible. There's nobody who's going to build something. There's nobody who's going to want to invest for the long term. And that's a big part of it. Also, one of the challenges that they've got is brain drain. There are parts of the European Union that enjoy having folks come from the Balkans. They are already pretty European. They have decent education and they speak several languages. These are the kind of immigrants that European Union countries like to have, as much as they rail against immigration from North Africa, South Asia, and Africa. They kind of like to have these folks because they need the population. So there's a big brain drain. There's not much in the way of foreign direct investment, and there's too much infighting. And it's a little country, but there's some growth that's going on. So Serbia has a lot of advantages there. It is bigger, and for the 15 years has had leadership that has been focused on economic growth. The guy who's in charge right now, Aleksandar Vučić, essentially came to power in 2012, but then became prime minister in 2014, switched over to being president, as you do. But he had what political scientists call a big tent party, right? It's not focused on one thing. It's focused on a lot of things. It's trying to include a lot of people. Vučić's own history is with Slobodan Milosevic. So he is able to claim that nationalist Serb card, right? And say, yes, I'm Serbia for Serbians. Kosovo should always be part of Serbia. We're never going to cede that. I mean, that's what he says. It's a great talking point. You can't say anything else and stay in power. And he's been able to attract an awful lot of investment. And he's been able to do a lot of infrastructure development. And Serbia's economy is going pretty well. The challenge there is that some of the investment has built stuff that isn't necessarily that useful. And while people seem to be, I think, by this time, okay with the Belgrade waterfront that was built, the mini Dubai is what I call it. It doesn't look very Serbian, but at least it's there. A lot of the contracts have gone to Chinese companies and have been financed by China. And when you do a deal with the Chinese, it doesn't always have to be transparent. So the suspicion is that there's a lot of corruption going on. People are taking some off the top, and that some of the quality might not be as good as it should be. And people are sacrificing quality for the bakshish, for what they're getting to take out of it. And this came to a head just a couple of years ago in November of 2024, when there was a new bus depot or a bus structure that collapsed in the northern city of Novi Sad and killed, I think it was just a couple of dozen people, but it sparked a huge wave of protests against the government, calling out corruption, calling for investigations and things like that. These protests really gathered steam and have coalesced opposition to Vucic in a way that he hasn't had to face before. And so he has become not as strong as he used to be. And when he is challenged, he has to make sure that the one component of his voter base that he doesn't alienate is happy. And he cannot do without his extreme right Serb nationalist base. So the more he relies on that base, the more his policies seem to turn to the right, that he becomes more extreme in terms of supporting ethno-nationalist goals. And some of his statements about the Serb component in Bosnia and Herzegovina become less helpful because he supports Dodik and his drives for independence and kicking out the Europeans. It used to be, though, that President Vucic would do stuff to keep his Serb nationalist base on side, but at the same time, he would express frustration with this guy Dodik, because the last thing he wants to do is create some greater Serbia and have to take in this chunk of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a basket case of corruption and isn't economically viable. And suddenly he'll have to step back from the big plan, which is to make Serbia a wealthier country.
I'm trying to envision you landing in Serbia as the ambassador. Just for people's context, are there chief of missions or ambassadors in some of these other countries in the region? How much are you responsible for, and how close do you have to be to some of those other areas?
So, of course, there are chiefs of mission in the other countries, and we're a team, or we were when I got there. I'm not sure they are now. It's the ability of chiefs of mission to work together rather than back through Washington only, I think, has been limited in the new administration. But the person who was the U.S. ambassador in Sarajevo was a close friend. Same thing with the gent who was down in Pristina in Kosovo. We would work very closely on these issues, and we would have coordinated talking points. We'd say, this is the position of the United States of America. Not just that, but in Belgrade, one of the most powerful tools was the coherence of the Quint ambassadors. It would be the US, the UK, the German, the French, and the Italian ambassadors, plus the EU ambassador. We would meet with Vucic as 6 people pretty regularly. And while we didn't all have the same talking points, of course, there was a general thrust that what we want Serbia to be is a country with a transparent market economy that is moving towards membership in the European Union. And for EU countries, they have their own motivation as to why they want or should want Serbia to be qualified for EU membership. But for the United States, we knew that a Serbia that was part of the European Union, maybe I'd be talking about them the way I was talking about Slovenia at the beginning. It's just a fat little EU country. We don't have to worry about them anymore. There's not going to be a war that's going to take American lives. Done. Wouldn't that be nice? A little finish line action. Hang the banner for that one. That would be great.
Is it safe to say that you would prefer to see them in that type of capacity in the EU?
Absolutely. And not because I am pro-EU, whether I am or not, that's another question. It's just because it would not be the responsibility of the United States to go in there and stop any more fights. We don't need that. We got other problems to worry about. And the potential for the Balkans to be a force for good is very high. And one of the things that we've been able to do, and Glenn perhaps knows about this in greater detail, but despite Serbia's closeness with Russia and its deep desire to keep on the good side of Vladimir Putin, Serbia has been helping to arm the Ukrainians. So that's been an important component of what they've done. Why are they doing it? Because they like Ukraine, or they want to get a gold star from the United States? Do I really care what the motivation is, as long as the outcome is good? I think that's where I am.
So, Anthony, you had the Quint, was there another bloc that would do something similar?
No, they wouldn't do it together. So the fellow who is the Russian ambassador, and I'm pretty sure he still is the Russian ambassador, is an extraordinary Russian diplomat of deep experience on the Balkans. I mean, he was physically at Dayton. This is how old and how deep his experience is. It's like It's like Yuri Ushakov, right? That guy's been in the same job essentially for 40 years. So he would have his one-on-one engagements with Vucic. He would never go in with the Chinese ambassador. But China plays a very big role in Serbia because of the economic development and because there's nothing that Serbs like more than to play the victim card. They are the misunderstood ally, the natural partner. It doesn't really take that long when you're talking, especially if you're drinking with a Serb, before somebody brings up the Battle of Kosovo Polja in the 14th century. Get over it. This is when the Ottomans sacked Serbia, and Serbia lost and became part of the Ottoman Empire. And it really doesn't take long before you have to explain to Serbs why NATO, and in particularly the United States, bombed Belgrade in 1999. We did it to stop the Serbs murdering a bunch of Kosovar Albanians in Račak. It was actually going on, and we compelled the Serbs to respond by pushing them out by using NATO airstrikes. And that's why, Glenn, that's one of the reasons why the Ministry of Defense remains a monument to their victimhood. You mentioned and you showed the photograph of the Ministry of Defense still damaged there in the heart of Belgrade. If President Vucic was to allow the deal to go through to let the United States or a consortium build a fancy hotel there, then are we tearing down this monument to our lost soldiers? Are we forgiving the United States the unforgivable sin of not recognizing that Serbia is always right? So I don't know. It's interesting to look at.
We talked a little bit about Russia, and we should talk about the relationship with Russia and the complications there. You mentioned China. Who else are players in Serbia, in the Balkans? Any other countries that, the EU, but any of the Middle Eastern countries, Turkey?
So there's this extraordinarily close relationship with the UAE, and a lot of that is based on investment, but there's not really much in the way of politics that is going to be argued about. It's all about, it's about investment and development and things like that. And the UAE was the big driving investor to build the Belgrade waterfront. But I mean, that's just buying waterfront real estate, developing it and parking cash there. That's not necessarily building allies. A lot of those places are perhaps not even occupied, but it's a great place to park cash. So that's a really important relationship. Turkey's got a strong relationship, but again, it is more transactional. It's not ideological. Every once in a while, President Erdogan likes to talk about Bosnia should be closer to Turkey, but he's the only one who thinks that. So unless it is useful for him to get something. The same thing with the Kosovar Albanians. Every once in a while, Erdogan will say, oh, well, they're Muslims, so they must really want to be part of us. I think they like Rakia too much to get too close to President Erdogan. But yeah, there are other players, but the big ones are the Quint, Russia, China, and the EU as part of, or it used to be a component of how the Quint would be running. Now I think that, the Quint is not as unified a force in talking with Serbia because folks frankly aren't sure where we are on some of these issues, on whether it is good for the United States to have Serbia advance towards EU membership. I think that is still the policy. I'm pretty sure it is. I hope it is, that's what we want. But yeah, the relationship with Russia is much more complicated, though. And it's really interesting. Everybody knows that World War I started because Russia decided that it was the protector of the Serbs. And that's what was going on. They're Slavic brothers. They're Orthodox brothers. And that was an important thing for Russia. It's very important in Vladimir Putin's mind to see Serbia as a place that is friendly to Russia. And a friend wrote a great article on why it is that the Russians are able to see past Alexander Vucic helping Ukraine. So it's an interesting set of challenges, but big investment by Russia in Serbia in things that, frankly, we don't like them investing in. And it looks like one of the results of a long-time sanctions law is about to produce a positive result for us. So Gazprom and Gazprom Neft own the Serbian energy company. So lock, stock, and barrel, the refineries, the pipeline, the gas stations, vertically integrated all the way up and down. And OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the Department of Treasury, has been giving waivers to sanctions laws on that investment. And they've been essentially giving the Serbs a pass on implementing these laws. And forcing them to divest and not punishing them for having these close relationships with the Russian energy giants. And the bill is coming due. The government of Serbia has found a way to get the Serbian energy giant owned by Russia to be sold or divested to the Hungarian company MOL. So that's happening right now. And today it just extended the deadline before sanctions are going to be implemented for a few more weeks to get that over the finish line. That does a couple of things. First, it reduces Russia's direct influence in Serbia a little bit. Unfortunately, it may mean that with MOL buying their share, Moscow may get a little bit of cash for that investment, which is not a good thing in terms of the U.S. goals in the region. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know. One of the things that has continued is that both Hungary and Serbia have gotten sweetheart deals on energy export prices from Russia. And when you get to pay below market rates for energy and on-sell it to other potential customers at market rates, you could do okay. So there's a lot to unpack and to understand.
Ambassador, on the divestiture that you just described, obviously it's to avoid sanctions. Is this also necessary for kind of EU ascension or?
In a world where Russia isn't an invading aggressor, investment by Gazprom Neft and other countries could be a normal thing, but it's not now. So any divestment would help Serbia's case towards EU accession. I think the real reason is that if Nice Petrol is not allowed to use the international financial system, which, by the way, the United States still controls, then it's not going to be able to function. And it is one of the things that the United States can still compel. And it's one of the things that really pisses off the Chinese, that we still control this very important component of the global financial system. And as long as we're reliable partners, people aren't going to join the Chinese in their search for alternatives. But if we look like we're not reliable partners, then maybe they'll say, okay, maybe it's time for the United States not to hold the keys all the time. So who knows? So the Russia relationship is still really important. It's very important for Vučić and Dodik to look like they have good relations with Putin. And Vučić will go and he'll be there for the big May Day parade, and he'll stand next to Putin. So will Dodik if they'll let him go. So all of these ways of signaling that you still love Moscow and that you're grateful for the Red Army's assistance in kicking out the Nazis, those are really important things that they can do to show their love for their Slavic brothers. But at the same time, they're doing very well as EU candidate countries, because once you're a candidate country, you get to trade almost as if you were a member country. So these small and medium manufacturing companies that get to work in Serbia and export at insider prices with no tariffs to the EU, it's great for employment in Serbia, and they're doing great. And now they've got actual highways and bridges and trains and all that stuff that they can do. So interesting stuff. I want to shift briefly to Kosovo and the relationship there and how that's presenting challenges for Serbia. So again, it's one of these really emotional things, and it's a hot button issue. And it doesn't matter what your political stripe is. You can't say that if you're a Serbian politician, you can't say that Kosovo shouldn't be part of Serbia, because it's the heart of Serbia. It is where the Serbian Orthodox Church was founded. All of these cathedrals and churches from the 14th century are still there. There is a small ethnic Serbian component of the population of Kosovo who've been dining out on the fact that they're getting protection from Serbia. They don't have to be part of the economy. They don't have to pay taxes. Hell, they're not even paying for electricity, because they say, no, the generating station was built by Serbia, so it should be Serbian electricity. It's crazy. But the challenge that Vučić has is, if you are ethnic Serb, then you get to vote in Serbia's election. So if you live in Kosovo and you're an ethnic Serb and you vote in Serbia's election, you're always going to vote for President Vučić, because he's the one who continues to write your checks. The same thing with the ethnic Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They get to vote, and they are bussed in to vote in Serbia's elections. And those are automatically Vučić votes, as long as he continues to play the nationalist card. So the more he's challenged by these more pro-EU protests, the more he's going to have to rely on the nationalist card. So it's an interesting set of challenges, and we're going to have to see where it goes. But the Kosovars, I mean, Kosovo, unfortunately, is not a sustainable economy in my view. They've got the brain drain even worse. It's a much smaller country. It's an ethnic Albanian majority place. So Albanian is not a useful language in most parts of Europe. There is a Serbian component or Serbian minority that they have to address all the time. And it is a potential security challenge at all times. In September 2023, an almost terrorist attack in the Serbian city of Banjska, or town of Banjska, which probably had the support of the security forces or the intelligence service of the Republic of Serbia. Not going to get it all the way to get all that information, but it smells a little bit Bay of Pigsy, if you know what I mean. And it failed miserably also. It was much smaller in scale, but it was definitely, it definitely happened. So that was just in September 2023. The person who fessed up to it and took responsibility was an ethnic Serb from the Serbian political party in Kosovo. And my own personal opinion is that, yeah, he might have been involved, but he fessed up because he was already on a sanctions list for both the United States and the EU. So he wasn't going to get on triple secret probation. So, and while he can't travel outside of Serbia, he's got the run of the city. So he's all right.
So, Ambassador, I got two questions for you, and they could have the same answer. I'm not sure, but if you were still advising the administration with regards to Serbia, kind of what would you be pushing for right now? And similar question in case they have the same response. What if you were advising American or European businesses interested in going into Serbia?
So I'll start with the second one. And it's my view that the more American businesses are in Serbia, the better it is for Serbia and America, because we play by the rules. It's a pretty big deal to have a partner that is seen to play by the rules. One of the biggest successes I had as ambassador in Serbia was to persuade the government of Serbia to award a contract for a huge infrastructure project, a highway and a massive flood control project, to Bechtel rather than a Chinese company. And I made the argument that, look, people know that if it's going to the Americans, there's not going to be a big envelope full of cash going to someplace, and that shareholders are going to hold the company responsible, and it's going to be a product that is delivered to the specifications that the contract say. So this is an advantage that you have when dealing with American companies. So I would encourage American companies to invest for that foreign policy reason. I would also invest because the potential for growth there is remarkable. And it's a stable country with a good debt to GDP ratio, which means that if they want to do another big infrastructure project, they could probably float a bond on the London market, and people would buy it and they would be able to pay for it. So this is not a basket case country. This is not assistance that is paying for these projects. This is actual investment. But for the administration to recognize that we have shared goals with the EU in Serbia, and that Serbia as moving towards EU accession is good for the United States for straight up security reasons, is a good thing. We want Serbia not to be a consumer of security, but rather an exporter of it. And I really think that they could be that more. It's a developed country with a highly capable military. We've exercised with them. We've shared information with them. We've worked together on some important things. And I hope we could get back to that. There's a strong memory in Serbia, not just of the bad stuff that happened in the relationship with the United States, but also the good stuff. An extraordinary relationship and some great stories of the courage and sacrifice of Serbs and people in Yugoslavia during the Second World War. Because unlike Croatia, they weren't part of the Nazis. They fought them tooth and nail the whole time. And in fact, it was their success that probably delayed the start of Operation Barbarossa, the great Nazi invasion of Russia. And since they got a late start, boy, when General Winter showed up in the Soviet Union, things didn't go so well for the Nazis.
So you're suggesting it's maybe the Serbs did more for the Russians than the Russians did for the Serbs.
Yeah, but it was the Russians who rolled through with the Red Army and kicked out the rest of the. But
Yeah, well, not without some help from the Allies, Anthony.
not without some
Including,
important help.
as I always remind our listeners, the Russians did nothing in the Pacific until
Nothing,
finished the
zero
war.
things. That's right.
Zero.
Exactly nothing, zero. And no, it's an important point to make. The Russians didn't do anything for the Serbs long term, and the split between Tito and Stalin was because Stalin wanted to make Yugoslavia a wholly owned subsidiary of the Soviet Union, and Tito said, "No, we fought for this. It's ours, not yours." So that was an interesting period of history.
One of the Serbians was telling us about, trying to remember the name of the operation, but a major OSS operation. There were a lot of U.S. pilots that were shot down during the Second World War. And with help of the Serbians, the OSS was able to, I think it was the largest rescue.
Sure was. We go and we commemorate it every year. It should be a movie. It should be a movie.
Well, actually, we met with the studio there, and I just hooked them up with a company that does documentary films.
Right. I mean, we've tried to encourage them to do it in a bunch of different ways. There have been a lot, by the way, Glenn, there have been a lot of movies made in Serbia.
Ryan, by the way, could play the star. He could be the one of the downed pilots who falls in love with the.
What were they? 45 at the time? They were probably 22.
Oh, it was the Second World War. People came from all walks of life.
Yeah, all right.
And by the way, you look like you're 35.
It was an extraordinary sacrifice too, because the operation is called Operation Halyard, by the way.
Halyard, yeah.
Halyard. And it was extraordinary. Please look it up, all you listeners. It's just a really cool thing that the Serbs and the OSS did together. And they were able to get a lot of these pilots back in the fight, because that's what was going on. We needed them to get back in the fight, and they got back in the fight. So it was extraordinary. But they did it at great sacrifice because, of course, the Nazis came in and they punished the people who helped them. So it was really extraordinary. But Operation Halyard, you can look it up. Site. And there's the American ambassador will every year go to the site of Operation Halyard and say, we are grateful and we were partners, because we were and we are. So
love it.
Very important.
Okay. Just on the fun side of things, and we talk some serious stuff. You mentioned when you have to get drinking with people in this part of the world. What are you drinking when you're in Serbia? And what is it that fattens you up there that you like so much?
My God. Well, Glenn had only a little bit of a taste of it, but meat is on the menu and it is good. It is delicious. But Serbian food is fantastic. And, Glenn, I'm sorry to do this, but the best baklava I ever had was in Sarajevo. So, Allah. And the relationship between the Turks and the Serbs ethnically is not that positive, but it's there. You ask a Serb, are there any Turkish words in Serbian? They'll say yok, which is no in Turkish. No, there's lots of Turkish influence in the Serbian language and the Serbian cuisine, but the food is fantastic. But the drinking is different, and everybody's into it. You can rent at Home Depot the way you would rent a cement mixer. You can rent a still and make your own hooch. So it is a hobby that people make. They make their own rakia. Rakia is the generic word for fruit brandy. So šljivovica, plum, is the plum version of rakia. It's just fantastic. Funny story from my time in Croatia. The guy who was coming to Croatia to be the head of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund office, he was from one of the Scandinavian countries that regulates alcohol to a ridiculous degree. And he was determined that he was going to get into this. And he arrived right at the peak of the plum harvest. So he goes down to the equivalent of Home Depot, rents himself a still, and then mashes up, because he didn't have the right tool, with his hands, some like 100 kilos of plums in his bathtub. And then they suddenly call him up the next Monday saying, oh, your meeting with the president came through. So suddenly he's got to go to meet with the president, and his hands are they're purple and they're all cut up because the pits of the plums are just so sharp. And he goes in there and he's like shaking hands with the president. The president looks down and says, I know what you've been doing.
That probably won him over, huh?
Absolutely.
Probably a positive thing.
Absolutely. It was a total positive. And
yeah.
It was a great batch. You got to be careful because, you can make it too strong and it becomes a little hard to drink. But They don't slam down shots of rakia the way Russians do vodka. They dip it throughout the meal. They start the meal with it, and they keep going straight through. One thing that's new in Serbia, though, or not new, but certainly better, is the wine industry. It's just fantastic.
Mm.
And the Serbian wines are extraordinary. Everybody's heard about Croatian wines. They've had a lot of time to get their act together, and that's a great industry. But in my view, very, very overpriced. But wines from North Macedonia and Serbia are still pretty affordable, and now they are very good. So keep an eye out.
Glenn, maybe that's where we need to start the RH Vineyard one day.
I'm ready.
That
ready.
I like it. No, I'm glad that I thought Anthony was trying to dodge the drinking question, but I'm glad he addressed that. The only question I have to Anthony, what is the the population of Serbian Americans? As an ambassador, I'm sure you had to have.
It's a great question. And, I served in Armenia as well. And the population of Armenian Americans is much bigger than the population of Serbian Americans. Armenian Americans, Greek Americans, to a large extent Jews, have retained that ethnic identity across generations in the United States. So their diasporas remain really, really strong as identifying as Armenians, generations down. Serbs tended to integrate more into American society. So the power of a Serbian American diaspora is less influential in Serbia than would be useful for the United States. But there have been some very, very powerful Serbian Americans who've had a strong influence on the United States. Mihailo Pupin, if you're a New Yorker, and I'm pointing at you, Glenn, if you go up to Columbia, you'll be able to see the building named after him. He's an extraordinary scientist and a very powerful advocate for Serbia during the First World War, and helped build relations with the United States. Serbian flag flew over the White House during that period. There's only one other national flag that's flown over the White House, and that was France during a different time. But yeah, so they'll never let you forget that one either. So that story comes right after the defeat of Kosovo Polja. But the Serbian Orthodox Church in the United States is strong, but it's not as influential as perhaps other ethnicities would have in terms of the diaspora.
Yeah. And of course, when you fly into Belgrade, you land at Nikola Tesla Airport, right? So Tesla,
I almost got in trouble.
All you car drivers out there.
I almost got in big trouble because of that. So this Air Serbia has a beautiful plane with the image of Nikola Tesla on its tail. And yeah, it's a Boeing. And Nikola Tesla was born in what is now Croatia, but he was obviously a Serb, and his father was a Serbian priest, in fact. But when there was a ceremony to inaugurate the kickoff or the resumption of direct flights to the United States with this fancy airplane, and I said one of the easiest ways to get in trouble is to say that Nikola Tesla wasn't a Serb, and then suddenly everybody's like, because they thought I was going to acknowledge that he was a Croatian. I said, he's not a Serb, he's an American, because that's where he succeeded, and an extraordinary inventor, and the United States owes him a debt of gratitude. And you can still see his name on the generators in Niagara because they're still working. It's extraordinary.
All right. And then 40 years of service, Ambassador, what's the most surreal moment or person you encountered or you remember from that time?
Well, there's a couple of stories that I would jump in there with, but one of them has to be the Armenian politician, the Gagi Tsarukyan, who doesn't go by the nickname, but he's called behind his back, Dodi Gago. He was at one time, the arm wrestling champion of the world. He's this massive dude. And he was quite a corrupt politician, but that's after the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. He got very wealthy. I ended up going and meeting with the guy because he was a powerful politician. He kept not just Arabian stallions. He could never get it on one. He probably weighed 350 pounds. So he's this massive guy. But he also had a breeding pair of lions on his territory. And he introduced them to my sons. And the mother was not pleased. She was behind a very thin fence. And I said, you know what? I think we've had enough of this. That's about enough. But I was also detained by the Russian border guards in Ingushetia, near Chechnya, because I was still on this fecal roster for being PNG'd from Belarus. I came back from Turkey. I was going back to Grozny, to Chechnya, and I landed in Ingushetia on the holiday of the border guards, and it was in the afternoon. So there wasn't anybody sober. in the border post. And they saw my name on that list and they threw me in a cell.
Wow.
It was at a time, and it's hard for our listeners now to understand this, to communicate between someplace like Ingushetia and Moscow and get a green light or a red light. And so I was there for hours. And finally, somebody had noticed and called back to the headquarters. And it ended up being Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State, calling the foreign minister of Russia before I got sprung. But there was one guy who was convinced I was about to be taken out and shot. So it was his job to get me a drink. So there would be one dude who was so wasted he couldn't speak. He would like open the door and he would be sneaking into my cell with a bottle and a glass. And suddenly the one sober guy said, "Oh my God, there he goes again." And then they would get him. Go away. But yeah, that was one of the more bizarre events. That was pretty crazy.
Great
Pretty
story.
crazy. But all the interesting stories come from expeditionary diplomacy, in my view. So when we're out there in places that haven't yet decided what kind of countries they're going to be, and they're interested in the advice of the United States, and they want to hear what we have to say. So those are the places that make it more interesting.
I hope we can have you back on, Ambassador. Really appreciate it. We can talk Russia, and you can call us on some of our BS. I like it. Glenn, why don't you round us out?
Well, I'll just say thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Ryan. We're waiting for a big snowstorm here in the Virginia side on the East Coast. Well, you guys are basking in the warm weather and vineyards. I do agree with Anthony, the great wine in Serbia. And we're going to get back to that film, the documentary film. We're going to make that happen.
Operation Halyard. You could look it up.
Great story.
It is a fantastic story.
Touches to our roots. So
really
anyway,
does.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Take care, everyone. Thanks. It's been lovely. So long now.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.